Welcome to Constant Variables, a podcast where we take a non-technical look at building and growing digital products. I'm Michael Roth. Let's get nerdy.
This episode is sponsored by the Mahonis Group, your partner for expert iOS, Android, and Ruby on Rails development. Even if you only need a little here and there development for your app, we're here to help. We've found that it's hard for companies to hire part-time developers, so let us fill that role for you while you reap the benefits. Reach out to us at jmg.mn.
Hey Rob, welcome back.
How you doing?
Great. Excited to talk with one of the OGs of this podcast.
Yeah, I think I was on episodes 1 through 10, I want to say.
If you haven't listened to much of our backlog, Rob is one of the founders at the Mahonis Group, and he contributed to the Constant Variables podcast quite a bit in the early evergreen episodes. Anything from lessons learned while we were building our own application to what might be a good or bad idea for your application. So as a founder's role often changes, as many app owners know, Rob, could you give the audience a bit of an update on what your role has updated to at the Mahonis Group?
Yeah, I do a little bit of everything, honestly. It was primarily focused on development and getting projects done. And now I'm more, doing tasks related to running the business, marketing, sales, helping out craft like the development procedures that the team follows, and all of the other little things. I still develop some too, so I still have my hands in code, just not as much as I used to back in the early days.
It's funny because it seems like you do a lot of development and then you send us out different, HR updates too. So it seems like you are doing something all the time in the background.
I try to pack it in when I'm at work. I get serious about it.
So you're on the show today to talk about two new operating systems that recently became public, Android 13 and iOS 16. While there's a lot of things developers should know about each of these new operating systems, we're going to focus around what app owners specifically need to know. So if you have an app on the App Store, the Google Play Store, or you're planning to build one soon within the next year or so, this will be pretty applicable to you. Let's start focusing around Android 13. Tech Republic had released an article regarding 85% of Android users being concerned about privacy, and it really seems like that should be closer to 100. But does Android 13 address any privacy concerns that app owners should be aware of?
Yeah, so Android 13, they have a new way of copying and pasting where some of it will show up on your home screen, and developers have to add an extra line of code to make sensitive content not appear there. It would give you like the ... instead of like, say you were wanting to copy a password over. It could show you what the password was. Instead, if you mark it as private, it'll just give you a ... showing that you copied it, but it's not going to display it for the whole world to see.
Okay, so previously it was even showing potentially the password on the front end where the user would be interacting with it, like literally on their screen?
Yes.
Gotcha. In reading articles, I was almost thinking it may have been just on the code side, but that is definitely pretty exposed.
Yeah, so that code will help handle that issue and make everything, if you want to hide certain data a little bit better, now you can.
Got it. And outside of those privacy issues, are there any other things that Android has been updating with this newest release?
One of the big ones is previously in Android 12 and below, apps did not have to get user permission to send push notifications, which is a little bit odd because in iOS, ever since runtime permissions have been a thing, notifications have been one of them. Now as of 13, users have to grant system permission for apps to send push notifications.
That's shocking. I think my last experience with an Android device was probably a Samsung Galaxy S5, and I couldn't even tell you what operating system it was running. But as long as I've had a phone, it seems like I've always been asked about permissions because it's mainly been an iPhone. I'm shocked that it was previously just enabled by default if the app called for it.
Even while I would be developing apps for Android and adding different permissions, I'd be, Googling what the syntax was for the notification permission and then have to remember every time, like, oh, yeah, they don't ask for that. Well, now they do.
Just didn't exist.
Yeah.
So any final Android thoughts there before we hop over to iOS 16?
Not really. I mean, there are a couple more notes you can find on developer.android.com, but there's actually not a whole lot there as far as like new things and new features. Like they do some battery optimizations and some, I don't know, just overall system optimizations, I guess, but not a whole lot that app owners would care about in this release.
Yeah, that makes sense. So on to iOS 16. Let's start with privacy again, which Apple's always been ahead of the curve on, kind of as we mentioned with notifications. What privacy capabilities has Apple added this time around that app owners should be aware of?
I think the big one this year is now to read what's on a clipboard. As far as like if you copied something, apps can get whatever's on the clipboard because it's a useful app function, but now you have to give permission to the app to do that.
Okay, so is that like if I want to copy and paste into Google before I can actually paste there, each application individually could be approved or denied?
Right.
Sure.
Yeah, the reason for this is when you would install an app, sometimes there are useful features that you can do, such as like, let's say you clicked on a link on the web and it had a coupon attached to it, right? It would remember that and carry it through to the install, and then remember that you had clicked a link from a coupon after you had installed it so it could autofill the coupon for you. That's a useful thing that people would want, but obviously when you're just reading from the pasteboard behind the scenes, there's also other malicious things that can happen with that kind of functionality too. So they're really making sure users are aware that, hey, the app's reading from the pasteboard, and are you okay with that?
And that's what I was about to ask. So if I had copied my password for, say, my bank account and used it, but still had it saved on the clipboard, and I go into another application previous to iOS 16, would they be able to read that information regardless of if I'm pasting it or not?
Yeah, they would.
Okay, gotcha.
I'm not sure how useful it would be, that being said, though, to have a random string of characters and whatever. But
without knowing where to apply it, sure, I'm sure that's quite the abyss to search through.
But the answer is yes, it could read whatever's on your pasteboard without permission.
Got it. So what else about iOS 16 might be important for app owners to think about?
There's quite a few things going on, and it depends on the type of app that you have. There's been significant upgrades to the lock screen in iOS 16 with widgets, so you can kind of customize the look and present important data right on the lock screen if that's something users want. So like, example, you have a weather app, you could format stuff to fit right on the lock screen, the current temperature, 5-day forecast, whatever might be important.
That's a pretty exciting customization feature. And I feel like when I was a middle schooler looking at iPhone versus Android, that was why I went to Android, because I wanted to be able to customize things more. So that's nice to know that they're making steps in that direction while still maintaining their privacy concerns.
Another big one is they've improved app intents. And for people that might not know it by that name, that's your shortcuts.
Okay.
So things like you can ask Siri to do something like, hey, Siri, look up this recipe in my recipe app. That's the example on the developer documentation. Well, to do that, you had to go into the settings and enable it, and the app had to run first. And it was kind of like a pain in the butt for users. And what I'm reading now is that they've enabled it as of iOS 16 that users don't have to do all that setup, and you can just tell them like, hey, Siri, do this in my app, and if you have it programmed in, it'll just do it without all the user setup, which is really nice.
Oh, okay, got it. So it allows apps to interact with Siri permissions without having to have the user enable it individually.
Yes.
I had to cover up my phone, and I heard yours in the background too when we started to mention that keyword.
It absolutely yelled at me, yes.
So, anything else around iOS 16 that you want to highlight to owners?
So they do have new features like integrations with Wallet and Apple Pay. Apple's been working on enabling states to let users have their like state driver's license as part of the Apple Pay wallet.
Oh,
And
wow.
now other apps can use like get the data from that to do age verification and some purchases, things like that. So like if you need to know like a user is over 18 to be able to purchase your product, you can then just kind of get it through this API.
Okay, that's very cool.
Also, it now allows you to do contactless payments right on the phone instead of needing an external device to do that. So when you go to like, I don't know, farmers markets and stuff like that, they'll usually have the iPhone, but also the like credit card reader attached to the cord. From what I understand now, you should be able to do all that just like a phone-to-phone contactless payment or, card to phone. To do
So
that.
the phone would essentially turn into a tap to pay surface, and you could either use a phone or a card.
Yes.
Wow, I can't believe that could be all software based. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I was excited to see that.
So lock screen widgets, very exciting for pretty much any industry that wants to get some sort of display, whether it's music, weather, health, anything like that. App intents, which I had no idea, but Siri communications, if we're careful not to upset her again. Apple Pay updates. Anything else they should be thinking about?
They have made upgrades to in-app purchases. So if you use Apple's in-app purchase system to sell whatever you're selling, they've made improvements to that system too, such as, easier ways to present offers, offer codes, stuff like that within the app. They've made testing it a lot easier for developers, so it'll be more reliable.
Sure.
Cool stuff there too.
I don't know how many of the details are shown in those initial releases in your developer notes, but around Apple Pay and maybe checking to see if they are of age, like we were mentioning, would that be any worry to the owners that they're then collecting actual driver's license data that they have to make sure is secure, or is that all done with encodements through Apple's operating system?
Yep, that's all secure through Apple's system. So we'll be able to, as developers, get the information we need, but then we're not liable for storing that data, if that makes sense.
Sure. Kind of closing your eyes and handing it off from one to the other.
Yep, exactly. It also has the wallet itself also has code in place for order tracking too. So if you're getting shipments, you can pull it up right from there and see what you're getting from different apps.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So will that be a whole new portion of Wallet that you can interact with as a user that apps can contribute to?
Yes. But the catch is the user would have had to use Apple Pay to purchase the shipment for it to be able to track like that.
Okay, got it. So it's not going to be able to integrate with everything, only if it starts off in that ecosystem, so to speak.
Right.
Got it. Well, that's very exciting either way.
Yep.
With each new operating system comes the end of the support for older generations, and this time around is no different. When you're building applications, how many operating systems do you normally suggest that app owners try to include?
Well, it's kind of always changing for Android. For Apple, it's the latest too. So as we're going to start new projects on iOS 16, our suggestions will be support 16 and 15. So whatever's current plus the one before it. Once you get beyond that, you're only into like 3 or 4% of users, and a lot of it is just legacy devices that have been shut down. So it's with Apple, you're pretty safe that almost everyone's going to be on those latest two.
Okay.
For Android, the numbers are always changing. So what we try to do is cover 85 to 90% of users based on the time when we start the project.
Oh, okay. And is that do you have any way to gather that information in general, or do you go to the users of each app owner?
So the best way to get it right now, there used to be websites we would pull it from back in the day, but the best way to get it right now is Android Studio. When you start a new project, it'll give you the statistics. So it'll be like, what's your minimum version you're going to cover? And you can click like, well, maybe I want to cover Android 8 and up, and it'll tell you this will cover 92% of users. And if you say, okay, what about 9? It'll say this will cover 88% of users. And so you try to find the right one based on the time.
Sure. That's a useful tool then.
Yeah.
And that lets you project into the future, I assume?
It does, yeah. I mean, you can kind of guess too, like if your build out's going to be a year, maybe you want to be a little bit more ahead of that. Like you could, even if it's not the full coverage now, it will be by the time people have bought new phones over the next year and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. As an app owner that's actively developing with a team, are there any things that they should be expecting that their team reach out to them each time a new operating system's released?
Well, definitely if there's functionality that will impact their current app. The push notifications for Android is a big one. We've been letting our customers know about that and have been ahead of the curve, making sure that once Android 13 is in the public, that the push notifications are still going to work.
Sure.
And then once it is out, sometimes, there are good ideas that you can suggest based on, hey, your app does this, so we should include this because this will help your product out.
Definitely. So the app owners almost need to do a little bit of their own due diligence to make sure that nothing is popping out as obvious that should come up.
Yeah. You can also get the new operating systems and test it out. But yeah, your development team should be helping you with the testing as well as making sure you're utilizing the newest and best features so that your app can be the best it can be for all of the users.
Yeah, and I'm sure each time the OSs come out, they have different focuses, like how Android's is mainly around that one privacy update and the notifications, and Apple's got a few more quality of life improvements around the lock screen and payments.
Yeah. I mean, Apple's iOS 15 update was not that much. It was kind of just more like stability in my mind. In iOS 16, they've really revamped things, so it'll be interesting to see how, the weeks after it's released go.
Absolutely. And in significant updates like that, have you seen in the past, because I know you've been developing on Apple pretty much since it started, are people normally pretty quick to dive in and experiment with those things? Or when it's a big shock like that, is it slower to get adopted?
Apple users usually get on it really fast. Some of them will wait for a point release or two to make sure some of the bugs have been worked out, but adoption happens very quickly on iOS. So the moment it goes out, you can expect it to be in the hands of a lot of users.
Sure.
Android, it's more of a slow over time thing.
Interesting.
Like I just read on Android 12, only 17.5% of Android users are on their latest one, and we're getting ready for 13 now.
Wow. So under 1/4 of their users are on what's going to be the one step older operating system?
Yes. 32% are on Android 11 still.
Man. And from my understanding, Android 13 is not available on all of their devices either. So that's going to be a pretty slim margin of their user base that'll be able to access it at all.
Right. And it'll grow over time. But like I said, it's more of a slow trickle process with Android.
I suppose that is partially, they do have more support into older operating systems as well compared to Apple, right?
Yes.
Got it.
So it's not common for Android apps to be supporting 5, 6, 7, 8 versions back, depending on the features and what's changed. Once you start a project, usually you don't have to stop supporting older versions as you go on, unless it really makes sense to for a certain reason.
Okay. And would that be privacy related because you could no longer manage data, or what are a couple examples there if it's easy to think of?
Well, if an Android user bought a phone 3 years ago and they're still using it and it was an Android 9 phone, your app will work as it did when Android 9 was new. There's no reason to stop supporting Android 9 per se, but you have to be kept up with the new things that you have to be compliant with for 13 at the same time.
Okay, got it. Any other final thoughts around either operating system?
I don't know. Android kind of looks like, not a whole lot of new things, but, just better overall performance, which is nice. iOS has done some, I'd say, bigger changes. I'm excited for being able to edit text messages. That has probably been a long time coming.
Yeah.
Which every other messaging app does it except for texting, which I find crazy, but now you can.
Right, absolutely.
And I'm excited to keep playing around with it, and because I'm an iOS user myself, so I'll be digging into some of those cooler features as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely be looking into the customization with widgets as apps start to support that. I'm definitely looking forward to that one.
Thanks to Rob Bentley for joining the podcast today. You can find him on LinkedIn at the link in our show notes. If you're looking to learn more about your new host, you can connect with Michael Roth on LinkedIn. Show notes for this episode are at constantvariables.co. You can get in touch with any of us here at Constant Variables by sending an email to hello@constantvariables.co. And you can also find us on Twitter at CV_podcast. Today's episode was produced by Jenny Karkowski and edited by the victorious Jordan Doust. This episode was brought to you by the Jed Mahonis Group. Check us out at jmg.mn and sign up for our monthly newsletter at jmg.mn/news.